Think about places like Egypt, Libya, Jordan, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Yemen. Yep, you've probably seen the headlines or social media posts showing the struggles they face. But here's the kicker. Aside from their economic battles, there's another common thread tying them all together. They're primarily Islamic nations. Now, before jumping to conclusions, let's pause and ponder a few things. First off, isn't it curious that despite the rich cultural and historical heritage these countries boast, they're often in the headlines for economic hardships? And then there's the Persian Gulf, where countries like Qatar and the UAE are just rolling in oil wealth. So, why the stark contrast within the same religious majority? Is it all about location and natural resources, or could there be more to the story? So, what's really going on here? This is why most Muslim countries are poorer. Many theories float around, blaming the Islamic religion and culture or pointing fingers at the lasting impacts of Western colonialism. It's not that simple though. There could be cultural factors that stop progress, and colonialism hasn't been easy, but these don't seem to get to the root of the problem. A lot of scholars have written pages and pages about this topic, trying to figure out why these two groups of people were so different. Still, out of all the ideas that have been put forward, there are two that have become very popular. And then there are people who say that Islamic culture and faith are inherently against the idea of growth. For these people, Muslims don't like things like business or government for religious reasons. 60% of the countries in the world are run by democracy systems, but only 14% of Muslims live in countries that use these kinds of systems. But there are also people who make the case for a second idea. Some people say that the trouble in Muslim countries is not their faith, but the way they were colonized by Western countries and how they are still being colonized because of their religion. So let's be clear, people who care about visual economics, some parts of these countries' cultures may be holding them back from progress, and colonialism has not helped these places at all. But we have to say that from where we are, none of these reasons seem to be the main reason why the Islamic world's economy has failed. In the year 1000, the Muslim Middle East was a major economic power, making up 10% of the world's GDP. But wait, things changed quickly. By the 1700s, the Islamic world's GDP had dropped to just 2.2%. Thus, what in the world happened from the year 1000 to 1600? Take a moment to think about this if you don't believe me. We can all think of great ideas like math, modern medicine, and ways for watering plants. In fact, many of these discoveries were made or improved by Muslims in the Middle Ages. We can see that these Muslim countries were pretty rich, even though they were Muslim. At that time, religion didn't seem to be a problem. So what about the idea of colonialism? The Islamic world used to have 10% of the world's GDP, but by 1700, it only had 2.2%. In other words, these places were poor before they were colonized. So the questions are pretty clear. What happened in the Islamic world's economies between the 10th and 16th centuries that stopped all progress? What did Europe do right that these other countries didn't? And this might be the most important question. Does this split from more than 500 years ago explain what's going on now? Muslims were a force while Europe was stuck in the Middle Ages. Not only that, but Baghdad had between 500,000 and 1 million people living in it in the year 1000, which was a lot more than any city in Western Europe. At that time, the biggest city in Europe was also Islamic. The city in question was Cordoba of Al-Andalus, which is now Spain and had about 450,000 people living in it at the time. In the Islamic world, after all, trade and money were common ways of life. It turned out that the journey to Mecca was the biggest trade show in the world, and even Islamic teachers had close ties to the business world. When compared to European companies, Islamic companies were like little versions of themselves. Why? Well, Islamic rules about succession were very important. Equal distribution was required by the Quran, which made it hard for boys to take over their father's businesses. Adding the fact that banks came late and people don't like loans with interest rates makes for a great recipe for long-term economic dwarfism. There is something that stands out about the Islamic world everywhere we look. The records of courts of Istanbul and Galata from the 1600s show that almost 80% of all businesses in those two areas had only two partners. Also, there wasn't a big company like the British East India Company with hundreds of shareholders. From the beginning of the modern era on, Islamic businesses were always very small and had trouble growing. In Europe, the first big bank was the Bank of Amsterdam in the 1600s. In the Middle East, on the other hand, they didn't start appearing until the second half of the 1800s. This means that there will be a delay of more than 200 years. The question is, why the Islamic world was so far behind? What was wrong with its companies that made them short all the time? A lack of big businesses is often a sign of a lack of new ideas and progress. How do we make sense of this? Well, there are a lot of reasons for this, but there are at least three that are very important to the whole problem. In Muslim countries, the Quran has very clear rules about inheritance that are fair for everyone. This means that you can't treat the other children badly by giving all of your money to the firstborn child. I know this doesn't sound like something from the past. This is pretty much how things are in the West right now. It has been done for a very long time in the Middle East, but not in Europe until the Industrial Revolution. Still, just because something seems advanced now doesn't mean it was helpful or good at any point in its history. In those times, Muslim societies were polygamous, which means that the rich and powerful had many wives and children. So, inheritance lost all of its power. What's wrong with that? Well, you see, the rules for businesses at that time said that when someone died, their business had to close down too. That meant the sons had to start over if they wanted to keep their dad's business. So many heirs meant that the inheritance were spread out among them, making it hard for one son to get all the money he needed to rebuild the business and get it going again. Because many business owners knew this, they didn't put much effort into making their projects last because they knew that if they died, they would probably go away. With that in mind, there wasn't much reason to build big businesses. The fact that big businesses didn't form is due to more than one thing. Remember how we began the last section by talking about how it took a long time for big banks to open in the Muslim world? In fact, this is also very important for business. What if there were no banks to lend money to people who want to start a business? There is no doubt that it is much harder. It turned out that Islamic law did not allow loans with interest. In contrast to places like the Christian West though, this ban was lifted after a very long time. Okay, so it's clear that there were always exceptions. In fact, the religious leaders themselves talked about ways to give loans that were legal under Islamic law. If someone borrows a bedsheet, you could buy it from them for 100 coins with the agreement that they will pay you back for 50 coins later. There were a lot of holes like these. Still, gimmicks were just that, gimmicks, so it was hard for the banking industry to grow. Because of all this, French companies could borrow money at an average rate of about 5%, but Ottoman companies had to borrow money at more than 20%. Because of this harsh interest tax, banking fell behind the times, and bills of exchange, one of the most important inventions of the Middle Ages, also came about at the same time. Italian merchants could travel without carrying cash if they had these letters, and these checks could be used in more than one country with different currencies. All of this financial technology can't be separated from the progress that was made in banking by famous people like the Medici. Yes, in the Middle East, many merchants still sailed with bags full of gold on their backs. This made the ships a great target for pirates and bandits. Also, there was something like bills of exchange that was much older than the ones used in Europe, but it was very rare and not very flexible. Setting up a business was already hard, but this made it even harder. Still, there is one more important reason that is necessary to understand why businesses in this region haven't done very well. I want to ask you a question. Why are there no great examples of Islamic and Western companies working together in the past? In reality, the answer is very simple. No Muslim could start a business without following Islamic law. So, a European businessman who wanted to work with an Ottoman had to agree with the Quran's rules. There are rules like if one of them dies, the business ends automatically. To understand this better, think about how the religious minorities in Muslim countries that were not bound by Islamic law did the best. These graphs show that non-Muslims made up almost 90% of all exports and imports from Beirut, even though they only made up 55% of the population. This was true all over the region. But there was another reason related to justice that made many Westerners not want to invest. Ottoman judges were not trustworthy. As a start, the judges of the empire, who were directly religious leaders, didn't really believe in written records like contracts. Yes, I did say that. In Istanbul in the 18th century, very few trials used contracts as proof. In those that did, only 3% were enough. To finish, many more people had to give their oral testimony. All of this was different in the Christian world, where contracts were required as proof in business cases before 1400. Who do you think they listened to when two stories that were at odds with each other? In Islam, most evidence was spoken, not written. There were two main rules that the judges stuck to. If a Muslim was on trial against a non-Muslim, the Muslim won. If it was a trial between two people of the same religion though, the winner always had the most money. It was all about corruption that day. All that being said, the explanation we just gave you isn't quite complete. There were a lot of the same problems in Christian countries, like not letting people borrow money with interest. In this way, what we see in the Islamic world is not so much a society that was bad, but one that just did not do well. They were not getting poorer, they were not getting richer either. And we're not just talking about money. For more than 1,000 years, the type of work contracts and the ways to start a business with other people have hardly changed. At the same time, people in Europe were coming up with new ways to run businesses. In the end, the sin of usury went away, and all the rules were loosened. The real question that needs to be answered is why the Muslims didn't do the same. Why didn't these countries come up with new types of businesses or copy Western businesses that were doing well? Let's take a look. People who do good things get help from God. Please take a close look at the following chart. The majority of occupations in the Islamic world prior to the 12th century were in the fields of industry and trade. However, the number of positions in military and governmental matters increased dramatically starting in the 12th century. The military greatly outweighed the merchants in significance, and the ecclesiastical sector gained enormous authority as the bureaucracy spread like wildfire. The term ulama, which means those who have knowledge, refers to the actual religious elite of the period, as well as the acknowledged authorities on Islamic theology and law. These religious elites were first supported by commerce and patronage, but gradually they drifted away from these economic ventures and grew closer to political figures like pashas, viziers, and sultans. You could wonder, why is that? Legitimacy holds the key to the solution. A monarch may become legitimate by virtue of his recognition by his subjects, his lineage from a notable person, or his status as the son of a king. But above all, contacting religious leaders was crucial, at least in the Middle East. Political leaders might be empowered by religion. However, why did religion become so powerful in politics? Crop failure is the cause. You know, a number of poor harvests, diseases, and conflicts forced many people to flee from the city to the countryside, where at least food was plentiful. even though the Quran prohibits feudal-type governmental institutions. The Iqta, or something akin to the European fiefs, then came into being. Both the ecclesiastical and political authorities suffered much in this situation. The religious academics had lost most of their revenue because of the decline in commerce activity in the cities, while on the other hand, the sultans were losing a great deal of authority to the feudal Iqta nobility. In light of this, the sultans and ulamas' marriage appeared to be the best course of action, optimal for them, of course. For the remaining residents, it hindered the region's economic expansion for about 8 centuries. A shared religion pervades all activities and shapes all of the distinctive institutions that characterize a community as it progresses from primordial tribes to orderly civilization. One common example is the growth of Islam in the Middle Ages. It is difficult to imagine the establishment of governmental institutions that are completely distinct from the structure of the recognized religion in such a situation. Conversely, Christianity arose inside an antiquated society that possessed a well-established political system and an advanced political philosophy grounded in non-Christian ideas. The suppression of the printing press, an act that left many historians utterly perplexed, may be the clearest example of the political-religious partnership, one of the most groundbreaking innovations in human history, as you are all aware, was Gutenberg's printing press. Less than 50 years after its founding, more books were published than ever before in human history, which resulted in a massive economic boom. On the other side, it was originally outlawed for more than 200 years by the Ottoman Empire. And you can see why, I'm sure, after what we've told you. The religious leaders saw the printing press as a menace. Just take a look at what the Protestant Reformation accomplished in Europe. The foundations of religious experts' authority suffered significant harm from the printing press. Their presence was no longer required when the text was read aloud. In order to make up for the author's overabundance in the text, their exclusive right to transmit knowledge was challenged. Stated otherwise, religious authority had a far larger role in determining political power than did the rulers of European nations, and even more so than individuals like the Catholic monarchs, despite having the word Catholic in their titles. Politicians were ready to make a lot of concessions in exchange for religious backing, sometimes in the shape of legislation that specifically forbade economic expansion. This explains why, despite their great harm, the inheritance rules previously stated survived for so many generations. Of course, although in many Eastern nations this tie between the religious and political elite still persists, in others it has been lost or does not appear to have thrived much. We do, however, know that history matters and matters a significant deal in economic growth, even though it is not entirely determinative. Because the institutions of the past have a significant impact on the institutions of the present, as well as the culture and incentives that exist in those societies, some of these nations adopted secularism through movements like Arab socialism, which differed greatly from Western approaches, and everyone is aware of the outcome. But now it's your turn. Really, was the Middle East stagnating or declining while its neighbors continued to grow? What additional factors may account for this enormous discrepancy? Will any of these nations experience a democratic and economic boom in the near future without relying on oil or tax havens?